Welcome to this deep dive. I was really intrigued by all these academic papers you sent over about the Book of Ruth.
Yeah.
Especially how Jewish and Christian commentators viewed her back in late antiquity. You know, we tend to think of Ruth as this sweet little story.
Right.
But like digging deeper, you realize there's so much more there. Like it kind of reveals some deeper tensions between those two faiths, especially in how they saw Ruth. So yeah, get ready to see a whole other side of Ruth.
It really is fascinating how a figure like her almost becomes like this battleground for these different theological and social agendas.
Right.
Even centuries ago. I mean, these interpretations really show us the power dynamics between Judaism and Christianity.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just jump right in. Both Jewish and Christian commentators kind of hold up Ruth as this, like, ideal woman. But what was it about her that resonated so strongly? Was it just, like, a matter of her being virtuous?
On the surface, absolutely, yeah. Her loyalty, her humility, and her piety, they're all constantly praised. Both faiths use her as this model of behavior for their communities.
Yeah.
Like take Ruth Rabbah, that classic Jewish commentary. It really stresses her choice to stay with Naomi, even when she could have gone back to her Moabite family.
Right, and that's highlighted in Ruth 4.6 too. Like she is the ultimate convert, fully devoted.
Right.
And then on the Christian side, we've got figures like Ambrose, a prominent church father, using her story in his exposition of the Gospel of Luke 3 to basically like illustrate how good deeds lead to acceptance in the church.
Exactly. But it's not all just straightforward admiration. There are these hints in some of the commentaries that suggest that maybe Ruth's good behavior was because of Naomi, not just her own doing.
So they're questioning her agency a little, maybe even a bit suspicious of her motives. It's like they can't quite reconcile her ideal behavior with her background.
Yeah, and that leads us to, the big issue here. Her Moabite heritage.
Right.
Deuteronomy 23.3 very clearly excludes Moabites from, the assembly of Israel.
Yeah.
So how do they reconcile that with her becoming so central in David's lineage and, ultimately the Messiah's lineage?
Yeah, that's a huge question. How do the commentaries address this?
Well, on the Jewish side, there are some interesting interpretations. They highlight this idea of a new law.
Okay.
The prohibition only applied to Moabite men, not women.
It's like they're reinterpreting scripture just to make space for her, to justify her being part of the Israelite community.
Totally. And they don't just mention it. They present this new law as, divinely inspired. They even kind of, they backdate it, like it was always there, just not explicitly stated. And this move legitimizes Ruth's marriage to Boaz and ensures the purity of David's lineage.
It's like saying, look, times change, even God's law can evolve.
Right, exactly.
And then they even go a step further in Ruth Rabbah 5.3 by using this fictional goal, which means kinsman redeemer, who's totally unaware of this new law. And this fictional character represents those who oppose proselytes, making it clear that they're pushing back against any exclusionary interpretations.
It's a really smart way of doing that. And then on the Christian side, you've got different opinions. You've got folks like Ambrose who celebrate Ruth's inclusion, as foreshadowing the acceptance of Gentiles into the church.
Which makes total sense given, Christianity's mission to grow beyond just Judaism. Fits perfectly into that universal salvation thing.
Yeah. But then you have someone like John Chrysostom, another big church father.
Right.
He takes a totally different approach.
Okay.
In his homilies on the Gospel of St. Matthew, he actually uses her Moabite background to highlight the imperfections in Christ's lineage.
Interesting.
He suggests that everyone, even those related to the Messiah, needs redemption.
So they're using the same fact about her to support totally different ideas.
Yeah.
Both trying to solidify their Messiah, but emphasizing different parts of her story.
Yeah, it really highlights the complex interplay between interpretation and the historical context. But there's another layer to her portrayal that gets a bit more interesting and maybe uncomfortable, her sexuality.
Oh, yeah, that topic can really expose differences, right?
Absolutely. This is where Jewish and Christian interpretations diverge. In Ruth Rabbah 4.4, there's this surprisingly explicit detail about her physical attractiveness.
Oh, wow.
They even use this rabbinic humor to emphasize her appeal to Boaz. It's pretty unexpected.
Yeah, someone was paying attention. It is interesting that they acknowledge her as, a full woman, not just like a symbol of virtue.
Right.
But then you go to the Christian side, and it's like they're trying to erase any hint of that.
Yeah, they're constantly stressing her purity and Boaz's restraint.
Right.
Theodore, in his questions on Ruth, is really insistent on that point. It's like any suggestion of her sexuality, even within marriage, is uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, trying to fit her into their idea of what a woman should be, which at that time was a lot about virginity and submissiveness.
And we see that even more with Ephraim the Syrian, who, in his hymns on the Nativity, basically spiritualizes her actions. It's like he finds her boldness, her taking initiative, problematic, for a community valuing celibacy.
Wow, so different. It shows how cultural anxieties shape how we interpret things.
Totally. It's a reminder that no interpretation is ever truly neutral.
Right.
We always bring our own baggage, our own worldview to how we understand things.
Which leads us to the big one. How do these commentaries approach Ruth's role in the lineage of both the Jewish Messiah and the Christian Messiah, Jesus?
Right. This is where things get serious. Jewish commentaries like Ruth Rabbah 5.6 offer all these really complex interpretations of a single verse, Ruth 2.14. They tie it to different figures in the Davidic line, all leading up to the Messiah.
And it's cool that their Messiah isn't this simple triumphant figure. Yeah. It's more complex than that.
They describe him having characteristics of both the Davidic king and the suffering servant from Isaiah 53.
Fascinating. It's like they're weaving together these different strands of messianic thought, right? Creating a figure that's a lot more nuanced.
Yeah, it really is. And then it gets even more interesting because they link him to the suffering son of Joseph from Zechariah, which is typically separate from the Davidic tradition. It suggests they have this multifaceted view of the Messiah, maybe reflecting their own complex history.
So much richer than just a conquering king image, right?
Right.
It speaks to this deeper understanding of suffering and redemption. What about Christian interpretations? As expected, they focus on Jesus.
Yeah. Some, like Ephraim, highlight her agency in becoming part of that messianic line, while others, like Ambrose, focus more on God's choice in picking her.
Again, those different spins, different agendas, but at the core, they're both trying to validate their Messiah by tying him back to her.
Exactly. And then there's Chrysostom again, in his homilies, bringing up the flawed lineage again, suggesting that even the Messiah's ancestors, including Ruth, need saving.
So even while celebrating her, he reinforces this Christian idea of universal sin and needing Christ. He can't let go of that, can he?
It's definitely a theme for him.
Yeah.
Then we can't forget Theoret, who ties everything back to faithfulness, saying her place in the messianic line is a reward for her loyalty.
Which makes sense with his focus on moral lessons, right? It's like each one is highlighting what best suits their own agenda.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that with interpretations, especially of sacred texts, there's always more going on than meets the eye.
Okay, so we've got piety, the whole otherness thing, and even sexuality. But then there's this unexpected point of contention, the theater. What's that got to do with Ruth?
It seems out of place, right?
Right.
But both Jewish and Christian commentaries have these strong negative views of the theater.
Yeah,
It was probably because of the theater's association with immorality in Roman culture.
So like in Ruth Rabbah 2.22, Naomi's warning Ruth against going there. Makes sense. A mother-in-law protecting her new daughter.
Right, a concerned mother figure. But then it takes a turn. John Chrysostom, in his Discourses Against Judaizing Christians, uses the theater metaphor to, get this, attack synagogues.
Wait, what? That's, not very tolerant.
Not at all. He claims they're full of, and I quote, effeminates and harlots, comparing them directly to the Roman spectacles he rants about elsewhere.
Wow, that's harsh. Like he's flipping the script, using this shared dislike of theater to demonize his opponents.
Exactly. And it's not a one-time thing either. He keeps making the connection, urging Christian men to keep their wives away from synagogues like they're more dangerous than the theater.
That definitely reflects some deep anxieties, right?
Yeah.
Tensions between the two faiths.
Absolutely. It suggests a real fear of Jewish influence on Christian communities. It makes you wonder if they knew what each other was saying, even indirectly. Like, were they responding, trying to win converts with their own reading of Ruth?
It's like a battle of interpretations, right?
Yeah.
And it's not just about her. It's about power. About who gets to control the story and the beliefs of the community.
And that battle, in many ways, still goes on today.
Right.
Just think how differently religious and cultural groups interpret her, even now. It reminds us that interpretation is always dynamic, influenced by our own beliefs in the world we live in. Makes you realize that even seemingly simple stories can become these battlegrounds for these competing ideologies.
And it makes you think about how our interpretations of Ruth or any biblical text are, shaped by our own cultural baggage, right? We can't pretend to be neutral.
Exactly. It's a call for self-awareness, to really look at the lens we use to view these ancient texts.
Yeah.
Speaking of lenses, you also sent over some sources that get into the historical context of all this. Understanding the world these commentaries were written in can help us see why they interpreted Ruth the way they did.
Yeah, like a behind-the-scenes look, right?
Yeah.
Understanding the why behind the what. So paint us a picture. What was going on in late antiquity that might have shaped how they saw her?
Well, I think, first of all, we got to remember this was a time of massive religious change.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity was gaining traction, challenging Judaism, and it wasn't just a polite debate.
Things could get intense, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
There was real competition for converts and sometimes even violence and persecution.
Wow.
And in that environment, figures like Ruth become, really valuable. She's the convert.
Right.
The prime example of someone choosing the right faith.
Yeah.
So it's no surprise that both Jewish and Christian commentators emphasize her conversion so much.
Yeah, they're using her as proof, as evidence for their side.
Exactly. And this plays out in some interesting ways when you look at the details.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one of the sources you sent over suggests that the rabbinic focus on that new law, that loophole about Moabite women, might have been a direct response to Christian claims about Gentiles.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting. So they're not just interpreting in a vacuum, they're reacting to each other, even if indirectly.
Exactly. It's a conversation across time and texts. And that makes it more than just an academic thing. It gives us a glimpse into how they actually lived in a world where religious identity was constantly being negotiated.
Now, you mentioned this was also a time when women's roles were being debated. How does that factor into how they saw Ruth?
That's a great question. And it's key to remember that, our modern ideas of feminism wouldn't have made sense back then.
Right.
Both societies were patriarchal. Women were expected to be subservient.
Yeah, but even within that, there was still room for different views on how women should express piety, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's where Ruth is fascinating. On the one hand, she's this perfect example of obedience, especially to Naomi.
That famous line, "Where you go, I will go."
Yes, used for centuries to celebrate female sacrifice and devotion. But then, you also see glimpses of a more independent Ruth. She takes initiative, speaks her mind, even reproaches Boaz in a way some found a little too forward.
And those moments seem to make the Christian commentators especially uncomfortable.
Right.
They downplay any sexual implications, as if afraid of a woman stepping outside the lines.
It's like they're trying to contain her within their acceptable behavior. But then you look at the Jewish commentaries, there's more nuance. They acknowledge, even celebrate, her sexuality.
Which, again, could be because of that competition, right? Maybe presenting Judaism as more accepting of women as whole people, not just submissive figures.
Definitely possible. It highlights how these interpretations aren't just abstract theology. They're about social dynamics, how these groups position themselves in this changing world.
So religious competition, evolving gender roles.
Right.
But there's another layer, right? The political situation.
Yeah.
Late antiquity was unstable. Empires were rising and falling.
You're right. The Roman Empire especially had a huge impact, both politically and culturally.
So how does that shape how they understand Ruth?
Well, it might explain those anxieties about otherness. Rome was incredibly diverse.
This huge melting pot, right?
Yeah, and within that, there was tension between holding onto your own identity and assimilating.
Right.
So Ruth's story, a Moabite who becomes part of the Israelite community, takes on this new meaning. It becomes about belonging, about boundaries, and navigating those boundaries in a world that's constantly in flux.
So you could see the Jewish emphasis on the new law as asserting their own identity, drawing a line in this increasingly blurry world.
Like saying, we're open, but on our terms.
But then on the Christian side, you have Ambrose celebrating her inclusion as foreshadowing the church's embrace of Gentiles, almost justifying their own expansion. See, we're inclusive.
And don't forget, Christianity was still a minority, often persecuted by those Romans. So the story of Ruth, an outsider accepted and part of the messianic line, would have been powerful for them.
It shows how these interpretations are more than just arguments. They're personal, reflecting the hopes and fears of real people.
Absolutely. And that makes studying them so interesting. It's about connecting with human experience across time.
Now, we've talked about the differences, but were there any agreements, any shared understandings of her story?
Actually, there's one that stands out, and it's surprising. Their shared dislike of the theater.
Right, we talked about Naomi and Chrysostom both warning against it. It seemed a bit random at the time.
It does, but when you get the context, it makes more sense. Roman theater was associated with, like, immorality, extravagance, blurring social lines.
So it was seen as a threat, not just entertainment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And both communities were setting up their own moral codes, often against Roman norms.
So condemning the theater was asserting their own moral authority. Our values aren't Roman values.
Right. And it's fascinating how Chrysostom, even attacking the synagogue, uses that same language. Like he's co-opting the values he says they're violating. Kind of sneaky.
A real power move. It shows how even in disagreement, there were underlying connections, arguing within a shared framework.
It's like seeing the wider world these commentaries were written in. Even when they seemed far apart, these faiths were in the same cultural ecosystem. They were influencing each other, even if they didn't always realize it.
And that interconnectedness makes studying them so much more interesting, right? It's not just about isolated interpretations. It's about how ideas move, evolve, and shape the world.
Yeah, it really feels like we're looking back and seeing our own struggles reflected back at us, with identity belonging and all that.
Yeah. And speaking of reflections, that whole idea of mirroring or responding to each other, we've kind of touched on it. But I'm curious, do you think these commentators were aware of what the other side was saying? Were they actually engaging in a back and forth, even if it wasn't super direct?
That's a tough one. Scholars have been debating that forever. We don't really have a smoking gun, like a letter from a rabbi to a church father saying, hey, you're wrong about Ruth.
Right. It's not like they were tweeting at each other.
No, haha. But there are some clues that point to at least an indirect awareness. Look at when these commentaries were written. A lot of them are from times when Jews and Christians were really interacting, often living right next to each other.
So they weren't isolated. They probably heard each other's ideas, maybe even argued about them. Their ideas were all mixing together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if they weren't quoting each other directly, they were for sure reacting to what was being said in their communities. It's like a big ongoing conversation, even if they weren't all in the same room at the same time.
And the stakes of that conversation were high, right? They were trying to win people over, establish their own authority, and basically shape the future of their faith.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where Ruth becomes so important. With all those themes of conversion and belonging and the Messiah, it's like a perfect tool for them to make their case.
It's like they're each saying Ruth's on our side and using her story to back up their own ideas.
It's this fascinating tug of war. And the funny thing is they use a lot of the same techniques to argue their points, like allegory or typology or just really creative ways of reading scripture.
So they're playing by the same rules even though they have different goals. Makes you realize how much interpretation depends on shared tools even when the conclusions are totally different.
Such a good point.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes studying these commentaries so interesting. It's not just about what they believed, but how they got there, how that whole process of interpretation worked.
And how that same process still shapes how we understand these texts today.
Right.
We're not immune to those same biases.
Exactly. It's humbling. It reminds us that we're all part of this long chain of interpreters building on what came before us, even as we try to make our own sense of things.
So what does all this mean for us today as we read the Book of Ruth? What can we take away from all these different interpretations?
I think the biggest thing is humility. Recognizing that our own understanding is just one of many. There's no one right way to read these stories. They've been read for thousands of years, and every generation brings something new to the table.
It's almost freeing, right? We don't have to find the one true meaning. We can just join this conversation and add our own voices.
Exactly. And along with humility, I think it also encourages us to be more critical readers.
Yeah.
To ask why certain interpretations became popular, whose interests they serve, and how our own biases might be affecting what we see.
So important, especially now with so much information flying around. We need to really think critically about everything we encounter.
Couldn't agree more. It's not just about absorbing information, it's about learning how to really analyze it, to engage with it.
So it's not about memorizing facts, it's about learning how to think, to be smart and thoughtful in how we approach these texts and the world in general.
That's it. That's the real gift of these old commentaries. They give us a window into how people grappled with these same questions centuries ago. and they challenge us to keep grappling with them ourselves, to keep the conversation going.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts for our listeners, something to chew on as they keep exploring Ruth?
I think it's worth repeating that interpretation is an ongoing thing. These commentaries aren't the last word on Ruth. They're just one part of a much bigger conversation that's been happening for a long time.
It's like we're all joining that conversation, adding our own voices.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so exciting. The Book of Ruth, like all great literature, keeps speaking to us across time, challenging us to think deeply, to question what we believe, and to find new meaning in these ancient words.
So to our listeners, keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep the conversation alive. Who knows? Maybe someday your interpretation will be the one that future generations are debating.
That'd be amazing.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, happy writing.